Chapter 13, Food Preservation and Safety. In this scenario here, which I call the picnic from hell, several people got sick after attending a picnic. And a lot of times when this happens, if people go to a doctor or an emergency room, the health department may get involved if several people are kind of coming down with the same symptoms. And so in this case, the public health inspectors did get involved and linked it back to barbecue chicken. So if we look here, whoever was preparing the chicken for the picnic cooked the chicken, but then put it back into the original tray. And then it also was left out in warm temperatures. So in this case, probably the tray carried bacteria from the chicken that was not cooked. Usually the cooking process should, if it's cooked properly, kill all the bacteria. But in this case, originally it was put back in the same tray. So kind of some lessons here. Foods that are going to be stored should not be left out in warm temperature. And so if they're not going to be eaten right away after preparing, they should be put into a refrigerator and then warmed back up. And also, if you have something in its original tray, that original tray is probably going to have a lot of bacteria in it too. So they should have put it in something new that was clean. Also, people should, after the cooking process, they should eat it fairly quickly. If they're not going to eat it fairly quickly, then they should, like I said, put it in the refrigerator or reheat it to its appropriate temperature, because there can still be microbes that are left over and they can multiply if they're in their optimal temperature. So this is an example of Salmonella bacteria. Salmonella is a common bacteria that's found in chicken. It's also found in eggs. So if these foods are not cooked properly, they can infect the digestive tract and cause a lot of these symptoms that we saw in this example. So when it comes to spoilage of food, there are a few reasons why we're concerned about food spoiling. First of all, it's just wasteful. If you, even just as a household, if you are buying food and it's spoiling, you've spent money on food that you now cannot eat. On a larger scale, if you are the company that's producing that food or you're the grocery store, you can't sell that food as well. So a lot of times it does come down to, besides just waste not being a good idea, ecologically, it also comes down to a loss of revenue, maybe for you as the consumer or for the store or the factory, as far as what they can sell and what they can gain money for. A larger concern is illness that can result and even death. There's always kind of stories going around where you hear about a handful maybe of people have died from consuming different foods, and so we can link that back to maybe those being spoiled as well. And so here it just kind of shows you a chart of different foods that are likely to spoil as far as being lost, and every food is not going to be able to survive the process. It is going to have to be thrown out, but we definitely want to try to cut down that as much as possible, no matter who we are. So as far as some general principles, there's different standards for different foods, and so a lot of times we're just reducing microbial contamination, and the reason for this is so that the food does not spoil, it can last longer, and also so that it's safe to eat and less likely to cause disease and possibly death. Some food is required to be sterile. If it's advertised as sterile, then there needs to be no amount of microbes. Something like a canned food, something that you would be able to eat right out of the can, maybe you would warm it up, but you're not necessarily warming it up to super high temperatures. That should really have no microbes. Canned foods can last a long time because of this in the way that they're stored. But if there are any microbes in there, then that can become a problem. Other types of foods are going to have acceptable levels. If you think about if you buy raw meat, of course there's going to be microbes in there. There's going to be a lot of bacteria in there. There could be bacterial toxins in there. But this is where following cooking instructions should lead to safety as far as consuming these products. So not every food that comes out of a store has to actually have, zero bacteria in it. So some factors to consider when we're talking about food spoilage. One of these is shelf life. And so usually food is given kind of a shelf life, and this is an estimate of how long it can be safely sold from stores, and then also how long it can safely be stored either in a store or at home before it needs to be used up. So usually foods that have more water content to them means that they have a lot less shelf life, because this is going to promote microbial growth better than you have if you have a dry food, because all living organisms need water. A lot of times also there's a manufacturer code on the product so that if there is contamination, then it can be traced back to the source of where it began. So a lot of times if you've ever seen a food recall or anything, they can tell you that this food was sold, it came from this certain factory, it was sold in these certain stores in these certain states, and other people don't necessarily need to be concerned about that because their food did not come from the contaminated source. So all that information is tracked, and you may not have really noticed that before. Usually there's also a label date on there. If there's a packaged food, then they'll usually have an expiration date, and this kind of goes back to shelf life a little bit. But a lot of times you'll see best by this certain date, used by this certain date, or sell by this certain date. I see that a lot when I buy fish. They want you to sell, the store wants to sell it by a certain date, and then maybe I have another week in order to use it, or I have to freeze it or something like that. A lot of times it's okay to go past the due dates or the label dates that they say. It's kind of used as a general guide. Something like milk, if you smell milk, you can kind of tell if it's spoiled or not. Fish, things like that, I wouldn't necessarily be able to tell as easily, but certainly I allow some foods to go past the due date, even if my kids say that it's, it needs to be dumped out. And if it smells fine to me, then we are not dumping it down the drain. But it's just used as a general guide. So it's not a perfect system, but it's definitely there for our safety. Another thing to notice is microbial load, and so I kind of mentioned this in the last couple slides before, but how many microbes are in the food? Sometimes it's okay if there's a lot of microbes in the food. If it's something like yogurt, we're eating that to kind of get these probiotics, and there's live cultures that are in there. Those are things that are not going to harm us probably, but they're going to maybe be helpful in our digestive tract and help us to kind of ward off some of those pathogens that we may come across as well. Other things like milk, raw meats, these are going to have some microbes in it, but as long as they're cooked properly, if it's meat, or if milk is refrigerated properly, it's never going to be completely devoid of microbes. But it's when those microbes multiply and the numbers get so large that the food starts to spoil. So again, with milk, usually smelling it is easy and simple to do. Also, some other factors to think about is microbial contamination. So in the food prepping process, you can have things that come from the air, even if it's maybe packaged. Something in the packaging process or something in the factory or something on the farm could have gotten into that food. Things can come from the soil, it can come from tissues of different organisms, rodents. I always think about, there could be rats crawling around in factories where food is sold. If you think about rinsing cans, I added that to my list of precautions with cans here in a little bit. But you can have things that are on the outsides of your cans that you may not control. And is everything going to kill you and make you sick? Not necessarily, but it's always kind of a good idea to do things and rinse those things off. Humans that are handling and prepping the food, they need to be following sanitary practices. And so, there's definitely regulations that are out there, but they're not always necessarily managed all the time as well. So we want to think about that a little bit just to make sure that our food is safe. Conditions for spoilage. And so we can break this down into intrinsic factors and extrinsic factors. And when we think about microbes, if we think about something like bacteria or maybe mold, these are cells, and all cells have certain things that they need in order to live. One of those is water. So all microbes are going to need water to grow. Some microbes can survive without water, but they would need water in order to hydrate later and to be disease-causing. But for the most part, anything that has more water content to it is more likely to spoil. If you think about, your cereal in your cabinet versus the milk that's in your fridge, you probably have to throw your milk out more often than you would your cereal. pH, some microbes, most of them don't like an acidic environment. And so something that's stored in kind of an acid is less likely to spoil. There are a few exceptions out there, and molds are more likely to live in a lower pH than bacteria. But for the most part, if it's an acidic environment, then it's less likely to spoil compared to more of a neutral or an alkaline. Physical structure, the more surface area something has, the more likely it is to spoil faster as well. So if you have meat that's all ground up, there's a lot of exposure, a lot of parts of that meat that are exposed to the air versus if you had kind of a steak that really didn't have as much of its surface exposed. The ground meat would be more likely to spoil faster because it just has more chances to do so. The chemistry of it, if it's something like fruit, things that like carbohydrates are going to be able to, glom onto that. These organisms are just trying to find their own food supply. In the meantime, they might be spoiling our foods. But if it's something like a meat, that's going to be something that more focuses on proteins as well. So you might find different factors in different types of foods as well because of the chemistry and what they like. So as far as extrinsic factors, we can look at kind of what happens outside of the cell. So this can be from the environment, this can be from how things are packaged. When we look at canned goods, then when it comes to oxygen, we're trying to devoid canned foods of oxygen. And so that microbes that like oxygen can't grow in there as well. So cans need to be properly sealed. If there's a little break in the seal, then that may cause an issue and the cans may not stay clean like they should, or devoid of microbes. Also, when it comes to temperatures, as far as refrigeration, how the food is being stored, how it's being shipped. If it's shipped on a truck and that truck is a cooled truck, but then the truck breaks down and those temperatures are warmer, then that could spoil the food as well. And then also we can look at osmotic pressure. This is you can see this with a lot of canned foods or maybe some jarred foods. But canned foods usually have a lot of salt content to them. And the reason for this is because if you did have any microbes that were in the food and it was in a really salty environment, because of osmosis, the water would leave those cells of the microbes and those cells would kind of shrivel up and they would die, not be able to survive. And so a lot of times you'll get that as well. Things that live in a high sugar content, even like honey itself has a lot of sugar to it, it's not likely to spoil very quickly because of that environment. And so we can classify foods as how perishable they are. So highly perishable, those are things that are not going to last you very long. You're going to have to eat pretty quickly, buy and eat pretty quickly. Or semi-perishable is kind of in the middle here. Non-perishable means they probably can last for quite a long time, a lot of times even several years in your pantry. So this here just shows some kind of foods that are likely to spoil quickly versus likely to take a little bit longer. And it doesn't mean they can't ever spoil, but certainly it's because of some of these issues that we talked about with the physical structures, the intrinsic and then the extrinsic factors. And here's just an example of highly perishable foods versus semi versus non-perishable. So a lot of these things kind of in the middle, you could see that maybe you can leave them out. They don't have to be refrigerated as much. But again, it has to do usually with their high sugar content or their high salt content or possibly their fact that they're kind of dry, like your breads here as well. So when it comes to the microbes that occur in food spoilage, this is important to kind of know what are the species that are out there that usually are kind of causing some of the problems here as well. And again, if you are the health department and you are noticing that people are getting sick from certain foods, we want to be able to track it down and find out, well, is it bacteria? Is it mold? What's going on here and why is this happening? So usually we're talking about bacteria or fungi, and again, fungi can be mold or yeast. And a lot of times these things come from the soil, they come from water supplies, or they come from the intestinal tracts of the animals that maybe are creating the food as well. And then things that come from intestinal tracts, if you have cows grazing out in a field and the cows have feces, that feces gets into the soil, it can get into the water supply, etc. So all of this can kind of end up back in our foods. A lot of times we'll see the E. coli bacteria as one of the prime offenders, and a lot of times that can be from eating undercooked meat, but it also can happen on vegetables as well if the E. coli from the runoff in these cows ends up in these fields where these things are growing as well. So also a lot of things can travel through the air, through water, and through insects and pass on these microbes. So some of the major offenders here, this is definitely not a comprehensive list, but it's a lot of times what comes up quite a bit. And so on the left side here I have bacteria, and so Bacillus species and Clostridium. You can see something like Clostridium perfringens is kind of a common food poisoning bacteria that we see. These two genuses or genera, there's a lot of different species names with these, but these are bacteria that form endospores. And endospores are those dry, desiccant structures that are able to survive pretty well. They can survive in canned foods, they can survive in dry environments, and they tend to pass these things on pretty easily because once they find a water supply, then they can kind of rehydrate and form their bacterial regular selves. Lactobacillus and Leuconostoc, these are some bacteria that sometimes are good for us, but other times they cause things to spoil too quickly as well. Salmonella, Escherichia, Shigella. Escherichia is the E in E. coli. These are gram-negative bacteria, and these are often found in intestinal tracts of humans and cows and different animals like that, and a lot of times they'll get to places where they are not supposed to be, and then they're not cooked properly, and so they can cause kind of some havoc to the intestinal tract also. That's where they infect too. On the flip side here, on the right side, fungi, which are yeast and mold, Penicillium, Aspergillus. Some of these are used in making things and making different products, and so sometimes they're good, but there are also some species that grow and they can cause things to decompose too quickly as well. Sometimes they can even be kind of dangerous for us if a lot of times maybe not even with eating them, but maybe inhaling spores and getting into the respiratory tract can be a problem. So there's definitely more out there, but these are kind of some of the common ones that come into play.